Good morning, Australia. Edward Gough Whitlam, the 21st Prime Minister of Australia, sadly passed away today on October 21st at the age of 98. Rising to become the head of the Labor Party, he led them to power as the Prime Minister from 1972 to 1975. In this special news report, we'll be looking back at the great impact Whitlam made on Indigenous Australian rights. On August 1975, Gough Whitlam returned traditional land of the Gurindji people after their long struggle to claim what was once their own. This brought an end to their long struggle to reclaim the traditional country. Since 1966, the Gurindji people have been on strike against vestige, the agricultural business occupying their land. Their protest was against the poor working conditions they suffered and the alienation of their land rights. Over the ensuing decade, the Gurindji people gained nationwide attention and support for their campaign. Once it came to power, the Whitlam government purchased lands on behalf of the Gurindji people. The ceremony to officially hand back the land to the Gurindji people took place on August 16th. Whitlam made a short speech before taking some sand, pouring it into the hands of Vincent Lingiari, the leader of the protest movement. Whitlam's now famous gesture of pouring the sand into Lingiari's hands was intended to symbolically reverse a similar act in 1834, when John Batman, the founder of Melbourne, claimed that the land in this area from its indigenous people, an Aboriginal elder had poured earth from his hand into Batman's hands. Whether Batman's treaty was a fair exchange or whether indigenous people with whom it was negotiated were even poorly informed of its meaning, it had been seriously questioned. Established the nation Aboriginal Consultative Community is one of the other great things that Edward Gough Whitlam did. The Whitlam government sought to improve dialogue between Indigenous communities and the government and seek their input into formation of policies that affected them. To that end, it created the National Aboriginal Consultative Council, an elected body of 40 members who were to advise the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. Any person over 18 who identified as Aboriginal was recognised as Aboriginal by the community could vote for elections. Gough Whitlam also drafted the Land Rights Act. The Whitlam government, the Aboriginal Land in the Northern Territory Bill was introduced to Parliament in October 1975, but the Whitlam government was dismissed before the legislation had passed the Senate. However, the Fraser government passed legislation based largely on the Whitlam government's bill the next year. This legislation allowed Crown land to be granted to Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, where they could demonstrate their traditional connections to that land. Land granted were to be held by land trusts as inalienable freehold trusts. The Whitlam government also outlawed discrimination against the Indigenous people of Australia. The Whitlam government passed legislation that abolished discriminatory treatment of Indigenous people when Queensland government failed to amend or repeal laws that were discriminatory towards Indigenous people. The Whitlam government passed legislation to override them. This legislation extinguished provisions that restricted the property rights of Aboriginal people, allowing the unique legal representation of Aboriginal people, and allowed unfair work conditions and wages to be imposed on them. The Whitlam government also amended the Migration Act to abolish the provision which required Indigenous people to apply for special permission to leave Australia. The Racial Discrimination Act, passed by the Whitlam government, also ensured that Aboriginal people could not be discriminated against in regard to their access to employment, their pay and working conditions, their equal treatment before the law, their access to housing and accommodation, or the access to goods and services were returned.